I am pleased and excited to announce our experts in the fields. George Wilson, Senior VP of Operations and Sales at Original Software. Mariagrazia Brunetti, Founder and CEO at Quence. Jacob Northey, Product Manager, Certification and Testing at ITIVITI. And George Mackintosh, CEO at TestPlant. Please welcome our experts, ladies and gentlemen. Well, test automation topic has been discussed in depth on various resources online and not so online, so we will try and avoid cliches as much as possible, so let's see if we are good at that. Let's start with the very beginning, and the very beginning in the test automation process is probably the business need to improve certain aspects within the testing. As representatives from various business units, probably we'll start with a simple question. What problems and difficulties you anticipate when starting and giving a go to a test automation project? As of now, I'm happy for you to start, but is there anyone who wants to start with that question?
I'm happy to start with that question.
Sure, perfect.
Certainly in my experience, one of the problems that we find is setting realistic expectations. Very often people have views that automation is some kind of silver bullet, etc. And there can be massive progress made with automation, but people in the business don't necessarily realise the amount of effort that they're going to have to put in to make it be successful and the ownership of that going forwards. And they also have the dilemma of who's going to be responsible for those automation assets and who really has the knowledge to maintain them, depending on the type of automation we're talking about. So I think people quite often go into it with slightly rose-tinted spectacles and with not necessarily appreciating the work that lies ahead of them.
I would completely agree, by the way. Not just because I'm called George as well, but exactly the same experience. We've had people who've dived into it and measured the success of the project by the number of scripts that they've written, which is kind of completely unhinged to the business point of introducing test automation. So so that's us as vendors, I suppose, or me as a vendor saying that there's more to it than buying the right tool, if there is such a thing as the right tool. So we have, as TestPlant, we have empathy with the challenges that financial services businesses have, but we're quite happy to work with people one bite of the problem at a time. And I think sometimes, if I may criticize some institutions that we have dealt with, is that they've taken an enormous long time to look at the project and then scale it to the level that they think they will require. So it becomes a huge procurement, and then a huge, almost cultural change has to happen to cope with the amount of money they've spent buying it, and then they experience problems. We as a vendor would rather people get their feet wet and start with smaller projects and 1 or 2 or 3 or a handful of licenses just to prove the point. And you could prove the point in 6 months, while sometimes making it into a bigger procurement process and a bigger journey into automation in one step gets you towards the end of the step and you haven't gained any altitude at all, so to speak.
Yes, I agree as well, and there are some issues that are relevant also to the people. That there are some problems like the one that you addressed, but also in the testing group, there are people that do not want to change, even if they understand that they are not working properly, and sometimes they are not testing at all, but they are fear to change their way of working. And so it's very important that there could be some strong stakeholder in the group and also on the technical side in order to address and to to be able to continue the automation process.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think one of the main challenges I see from the business and the technical side when you're doing a test automation process is that a lot of these efforts are very narrow-sighted. They're focused on, we have a huge release of a new version of our trading system, we want more testing. Rarely do we see people viewing this as a quality process that's ongoing. Like Mariagrazia here said, she mentioned that a lot of the automation, it's done, but then it's not continued. What you need to do is also, as vendors, leave a process behind and leave the expertise behind so people can continue that testing and that automation after you're gone. And I think that's the key is, putting in KPIs and a process in place so that the testing continues.
All right. So do you think that there is not much appreciation that test automation is not a one-off process, but it is an ongoing, endless thing that keeps developing with the life cycle of the product? Do you think it's a problem in business, or from your perspective, that do you think that people mostly understand that this is kind of a never-ending process, basically?
I think part of the problem is that everybody has a different view of what test automation is, and that's also probably correct because it's applicable in so many different places, and actually people say, let's put test automation here, and we think we're going to solve the whole problem, when in fact we need to be looking at testing and quality assurance as an overall process in many, many, many places throughout the overall thing. And there are places where automation will apply and won't apply in all those many different places. And yet we think, okay, let's drop automation in here. And I think classically at the moment, people are talking about so much about shift left and testing of APIs and all those things and applying automation there, which is great, but that doesn't solve the downstream problem. That only solves one little piece of the problem. And we think that because we're doing automation here, everything else is going to be perfect. And I think the software industry is particularly bad at that. If you go to any other industry, you actually have quality embedded all the way through the process. The most important person in an organization may be the person in charge of quality assurance. And in IT, very often, they're subservient to those gods in development. And I think that actually has to change before we'll be able to put quality throughout the software delivery process.
Right, okay. You also mentioned that there is, the way I understood that there is also a problem of underestimation of the efforts required for the test automation. Is it the right thing to state that this is what's happening in the industry? Underestimation of the efforts required for that?
The underestimation is sometimes addressed, but it should be something that has to be overcome because now software is everywhere and software delivery is continuously done. We are going towards agile development, continuous integration, continuous delivery also, because the time to market is always becoming even more strict, even more short. And so we have to, the company, the software company, the vendors, and have to change their mind in order to start testing sooner, or design and develop in order for testability. So it's, I think that we can say something for now for the classical development, but we have to look forward to the very near future that is here, and the future is that the applications are continuously deployed and very, very faster. So we have to change and not to think how if the testing effort has been underestimated or not, but what should be done in order to design for quality, because quality is an issue. The time to market is short, but the quality have to be high.
I might say, just for the purpose of debate, that very often there's an not an underestimation, but there's an overestimation of the effort that is required.
That's true, yeah.
Again, because I think people are making a meal out of it, rather than saying, okay, well, let's buy something, let's do something, let's introduce automation there, rather than find something that might be the universal solution, or a company-wide, enterprise-wide solution. So I would really encourage those who are making those decisions to almost tactically to deploy it where they can, and to do things in the shorter term, to build up an experience, and from what we've seen, actually to build up some real excitement if it actually works. And we've seen those who've got their feet wet, contained the project. You know, there's always a danger that vendors want to blow it up, and maybe that's why, of course, not TestPlant. You know, that's why maybe, let's say IBM, if I may say, I don't think there's anyone from IBM here. They might want to blow it up and make it a bigger project involving, and keeping within the IBM camp, IBM Global Services, and suddenly it becomes an enormous project that at the end of 3 years, it's very difficult to see that any automation has been delivered at all. We've seen that, and we've seen those who've moved quickly, within weeks, bought a tool in a project and achieved automation in an area that they then can confidently roll out. And very often, of course, we get the question, the ROI. It's very difficult to measure an ROI when it becomes a huge project. But it's not difficult to measure an ROI when it's a small contained project. So I just for the fun of debate, I think that people overestimate sometimes what might be required to introduce automation.
I would agree with that. I've seen overestimation as well. And I think it's also part of the problem that I was talking about, where in reality, particularly where you've got separation very much between development and QA and that style of things, well, we know development are probably going to be late. So what we're going to do is we're going to overestimate what we think we've got to do because we're not going to have the time in the first place. So there's a whole bunch of complex factors. But I agree with you. It doesn't have to be as hard as some people make it out to be.
Yeah, I think just from a different perspective on the same idea you guys are talking about here, from my perspective, it's not that people are overestimating; it's that they're taking off too big of a bite right up front. If nobody has, if you're talking to somebody that doesn't have automation, and they want to automate testing, the first thing they're going to say, we want to automate testing for this entire system. And the problem with that is that, okay, well, you know, getting 100% coverage, as everybody in the testing industry knows, is very hard. You know, it's one of those asymptotes. You get really, really close, but you never quite get there. But what you really need to do is break it down into two parts. One is we need to get the process around automated testing in place. And that isn't as big as you would imagine. It's, you know, getting the test, maybe one test written, getting a process to run the test, whether it's somebody manually kicking it off or part of a continuous integration process, and then start taking out components of the system and testing those and building test suites around that. And so from that perspective, the first part, getting the process in place, is the most important, I believe. And once that's done, you know, it's just a matter of how much time and how much are we going to invest in building the tests we need for our system.
Jacob, could I ask you, because you've got a funny accent,
He's got a phone.
are there geographic differences or are there industry sector differences in the inclination to move and make good
That's
effect?
a good question. I mean, I've stayed mostly in the trading industry for my career, so I can't talk about industry-specific differences. I do notice that there are different cultures in terms of how people approach quality. I think in the U.S. there's always been this gunslinger attitude of, you know, get something implemented and push it out and see how it works. And we've seen that with a lot of the failures over the last 5 to 10 years. And you know, in many other countries, especially in Brazil, South America, there's more focus on automation and testing and making sure you have a good quality process. So I completely agree that it's a cultural thing in many cases, although industry-wide, it's hard to say, you know, if there's differences between different industries. I'm sure there is.
Well, it's getting on a European debate here, but
Yeah.
is Italy ahead or behind where the UK
Depends,
might be, or in relation to the US?
It depends on the different market fields. because if you talk about avionics, and you know very well they have standards for testing, and you test the testing, and you so you do static analysis and product test evaluation and all that stuff. In the banks, I remember when I moved from many years ago, but when I moved from avionics to the banking system, I was scared before because they had testing activities, integration testing, but in general there were no time because of the extra time for development, and so there was the scheduling for the release to production or pre-production, and there was no time for testing, 1 day, 2 days. And so that was the reason why I tried to introduce automation a lot of years ago, where the tools were really at the beginning. But that was because in 2-3 days we should do something that it's better than nothing. And now things are changed, and also in the banks and in the financial and in IT in general, they do more testing, but they, generally speaking, deals more on manual testing. They use in general, test automation tools just to do test management, or a lot of or some building and release tools, open source, more or less, like Jenkins and so on.
That's quite interesting, as you've mentioned the other industries like avionics. So from your experience of, well, if we forget for a second the financial industry, avionics, telecom, and other industries, how matured, in your opinion, is test automation in those industries in comparison to what we currently see in financial industries? I think we all agree that in financial industry we are moving forward with the test automation, and more test cases, more and more functionality is being tested automatically. But comparing that to other industries, what's your opinion? How matured are we in the financial industry now?
Well, I won't compare it critically against the financial industry, but just as a statement, our experience in the United States with defense companies, and we, Mariagrazia and I, conferred on this a little bit. The adoption of automation has been around for a long time, actually, and somebody mentioned process in this discussion. So the object there was to bring it into the process, and it's now become a standard way of testing and then testing again. And we don't, as they would say in that industry, you don't expect airplanes or fighter jets to fall out of the sky because they haven't been sufficiently tested, and automation is a key part of that. So I think it, in answer to almost one of the points I made before, North America defense is actually quite a way ahead, and have been adopting automation to a very, very large extent, successfully as well.
Also in the telecommunication, automation is in some fields. It depends on the field, because if we talk about IT, it's there are some kind of different companies in the company. If we talk about an operator, a service provider, a telecommunication service provider, they have the IT that use automation or not, but in general they have outsourced all the activities to some system integrators. But if you talk about the network side, the core of the operator, they use more automation in order to test the load of the network, so the stability of the network and the integration of really thousands of different systems, because they have systems from many suppliers, and they are really very, very complex systems. So they use a lot of load and stress test automation tools.
So you don't think that we have reached their level of test automation as of now?
No.
It's interesting because what I've seen in the financial services sector, actually, the rate of automation is going up. I think you're right, it has been behind, but part of the challenges, and you contrast and compare to defence, is the rate of change in the systems that have been tested is much greater in financial services than it is in something like defence. So if you're building defence applications, they were probably designed almost 20 years ago. And yes, hence automation makes complete sense because you're going to be going over that many, many, many times. You guys have the challenge of actually this dynamic change, coming up with new products, new laws, new everything else, competing with other providers, trying to do something completely different and build automation on top of that. So it's going to be behind, but you're working on it.
I would add another dynamic, just again for the purpose of debate on this, and this may run across the interests of those in pure service, but in the financial services industry, as opposed to defence, we've seen some, and I don't mind saying it, some inertia from the service partners, or at least some complexity and delay because of the service partners in an approach towards automation. In defence, I suppose it's probably more macho, and those service providers are more bought into automation in the testing of systems there. So, we are talking, and I'm sure George and other members here are talking to major service providers, and there are service providers here. They know about the drive to introduce automation as part of the way they deliver services. But I'm just saying, as an observation, I think that I'm trying to show some empathy in people in financial institutions, that they've had to, as one gentleman said to me recently, it's push water uphill a little bit on that road to automation because of the significance and size and tenure of the service partner working with that particular bank.
And just getting back to the financial service industry, I think really what we've seen is that over the last 20 years, electronic trading is fairly new. Compare this to defense and telecommunications, electronic trading is still kind of maturing. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we're a little bit behind the curve. The other reason is, look at the 90s and early 2000s, there was, this missed opportunity. If you don't get your software out quick enough, you might be missing out on profits. And so a lot of the, cutting the time for testing was just, well, there's a risk reward. If I put the software in, it doesn't work, maybe that's better than waiting a month and missing out on we look at ideas like arbitrage. For somebody with an arbitrage business opportunity, they're not going to wait a month to put that in because it'll be gone in a month, right? So from the financial services perspective, there's been a different set of parameters that drive testing, but that's changing now. And as the industry matures and people realize, okay, we have mature trading systems, we have a mature environment, we have to introduce automation because we're still getting a lot of requirements for change, but we have a lot of inertia here that needs to be protected when we make these changes. We have 500 clients. We can't keep making changes every week and expecting, and hoping that it doesn't break everybody, right? So I think the dynamics are changing. That's why automation is more of a hot topic now in financial services.
Yeah, that's a good point. You mentioned that the industry is in the process of becoming stable in terms of requirements. There were interesting discussions earlier in this room with regards to the new MiFID regulations. The environment is constantly changing. On top of that, that actually means that businesses would suffer extra costs on maintaining their test automation. There's a certain amount of effort which would be required to develop new test scenarios to cater for the new requirements coming from the industry, from the business, from the regulators. Doesn't it mean that we are trying to catch the bird which is flying too high for us? Are we not trying to automate everything in a bit too early stage? Should we just wait a little bit, wait for the industry to mature, and then just achieve the level of automations like in the defense industry?
I would say the key here is that our APIs have matured. Fixed protocol is very standard, hasn't been changing as much anymore. And we can drive the tests through that still. There's still changing requirements. You still have change requirements for MiFID, but you want to protect what exists with automation. And there's a lot that exists now compared to 20 years ago. And so when we're saying we want to protect what exists, we have MiFID requirements. That means we're changing our trading system. but we don't want to break, our 500 clients that are connecting to our trading system. We don't want to break their existing functionality, even though we have to address new functionality.
I think in that context as well, there's also a lot of platform consolidation. I know there's a lot of software development going on, but actually it's now invested in a smaller number of group of people who are providing those services to wider organizations. So the focus of that is changing. You've got that internal focus, and then you've got that second, third party external focus. Both people are going to want to test these things. So you need automation here for testing assets. You need automation over here for testing the processes as they apply to the business. But for both of those scenarios, we need to get on with it now, because the longer we leave it, the more of a mountain we have to climb.
There's a little bit of an economic point to make here, if I may. And the economic point is that if, let's say the London Stock Exchange Group is a big business, and it was out to buy something from a SME or a medium-sized enterprise, as some of us work for, I would, as I said before, I'd really encourage them to go and buy a small amount as quickly as they can decently do it. But one of by making it a bigger project, and whether or not we won it at the end is not the point, but that just drains the life out of innovative companies in Europe. And that same innovative company in Europe, and I know this, may well relocate to the United States, because the culture there is more aligned to buying innovation at an earlier stage than it is here. So the economic point within Europe is that if the big companies want innovation, then buy it quickly, because those innovators will actually move their bases. And I could quote names: move their bases, or at least transfer more of their operations into markets that are more inclined to buy early stage things. And that's not just the United States. That's surprisingly Japan, in many ways a conservative country. South Korea is another country that we've done well in. So I'm making an economic point rather than a test plant point. But again, just get your feet wet is what I might say.
What I've seen on my perspective, that is more Italian and more from Italy, I've seen that there is a big interest in banking and let's say financial in general sense, more banking, IT, and so on a different perspective of test automation. Not many big banks and organizations have dealt with in the past with big investment on the so-called first, second generation of test automation tool, the one that generates scripts that have to be maintained, and all that activities more or less was failure because of the huge amount of maintenance that was required for that test case that was biggest than the actual return. Now there are more different test tools. We are going towards more easily to use testing tools. And I think that this is a revamp on the interest towards test automation, because automation to be successful is to be easily done, easily maintained, and doesn't have to require many deep technical skills, but has to be used by the business tester, the people that is used to design and perform the test manually.
Because that's the precious knowledge.
Yeah.
Is invested in the people
Yes.
who know the business process, and by separating people who have technical knowledge from
Yeah.
the process knowledge,
Yeah.
you create a gap.
Yeah.
So let's not worry them with technology. Let's give them tools that they can use.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree.
So if we are moving towards more user-friendly test tools, which do not really require programming language experience, is the industry tempted in open source free tools, or are we still trying to do things slowly with tools readily available and paid for on the market, developed by major players?
I don't think the open source tools really address your point at all. In fact, they're the antithesis of that, because they tend to be kind of a conglomeration of code provided from different places and different sources, and they're from that developer mentality. And they just exacerbate the problem that you described rather than solve it. And the consequence of that is there is a payback to be made somewhere else, in timescales, in people, in investment, in maintenance, and everything else. So I don't think so.
Open source could be suitable for developers. Developers use open source tools just to make their script, to test their functions, software functionality. But the issue with open source is the maintenance of the tools, the support that is always required by the customer, the training also. There are some companies that are focused also on training on open source tools, but they are not many, and they have to be continuously upgraded on the. So it could be more costly to use an open source test automation tool for functional integration testing.
I would agree. But linking it back to process, and in the words of a defense company that we're dealing with in the United States, they wouldn't use open source because they can't rely on underpinning their resource using that type of software. And they also have to build a process for their business which will outlast the tenure of any service contract that they that might be working in partnership with them. So process and outsource software doesn't fit comfortably in the minds of some of the people that we're dealing with.
And I would just say, if you look at kind of the drivers behind open source, typically it's developers who need a tool to do something. And they're developer-driven, and a lot of times they're developer-focused. So they come up with great testing tools for the development process, unit testing and behavior-driven development and stuff like that. But ultimately, you lose the market focus, like financial service technology, specific testing tools, or testing tools that really focus the business level and make it easily usable by the business level and do reporting and stuff like that. So, there's always going to be this niche for open source tools, but that's mainly in the core development process. It's not for integration testing and stuff like that, where you get a lot of value from people who know the industry, know the market very well, and can actually build tools that take a lot of that domain knowledge and build it right into the tool. So you're getting a lot of that stuff for free.
So if we say we are a bit cautious with regards to the open source tools, would you put the tools which are freely available on the market but do not have open source background, would you be cautious about them as well?
Like the tools we sell, you mean?
Well, you're selling them, they're not free, are they? We have a family of open source tools, and we might have a family of just free tools where you do not get access to the source code, but they're just freely available for you to download and use however you like.
Well, again, I think we've dealt with the largest telcos, the largest defense companies, and some of the largest banks. That option is often deleted when they go through a due diligence of where they're getting it from. Open source is open source. Freeware tends to be coming from a company with some other motive or some other business model behind that. So I would leave it to that financial institution to make their own judgment.
It's probably about as good as those free trading platforms that are out there as well.
And with the London Stock Exchange,
yes, of course, you'd be happy to use one of those and save yourselves tens of millions, hundreds of millions.
All right. So the flexibility of open source tools doesn't really appeal to you in terms of that you can develop and build blocks on top of something that's already available and modify the open source tools to suit your needs. That's not something that interests you as of now. Is that right?
I think, as Grazia said, that there's a group of people that perhaps that is relevant for, But then with that comes a whole bunch of challenges. So, that could be relevant in some pieces of the process, but it's not
I
a
read
universal solution.
I looked at a job advert recently here in London, and
Did you get it?
I didn't get it. I simply wasn't technically qualified suitably, but they wanted 2 test automation engineers for 9 months, and they spelt out the daily rate, and it was to introduce a level of process, which seemed odd because it was only 9 months. And it was a major business in the UK, it was named. And I reckoned that they'd spend £170,000. So, getting on for $250,000 or so for that assignment using open source. And I thought, well, that's a lot of money, which of course is disguised as being a contract and labour, and not without a sort of sign off as being a capital cost. As those individuals would finish the work at 9 months, nothing's left. and again, on an economic point, we as and it's broadly around Europe, but there's some focus in the UK, we're not investing. Big businesses are not investing in capital. And actually, capital is very often the sort of thing that we sell. We're selling capital goods, either on a term license basis or a perpetual license basis, which aid productivity. So, yes, we would take a stance against open source. Yes, we'd take a stance against freeware, but on a productivity basis, because the cost of fixing software is never free, and if you're having to fix it yourself, that's a cost.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to add that if you look at freeware and open source software, there's no revenue model, right? So ultimately, as somebody's making a purchasing decision, the viability of that business model is non-existent. So at some point, it's probably going to end unless they have some other way to make money. So you got to look at yourself long term. In 5 years, is this a test platform that I can rely on? Will I have support there, and so on? It's kind of hard decision to make to do open source, especially when the key driver for open source is, we can change it if we need to, but that cost is really high. I come from a development background, and I've worked with a lot of open source libraries, and there have been times when an open source library is abandoned, and we have to make changes. And even as developers, that's very hard, because then you have to start maintaining a completely separate library yourself, and that's very expensive, and I don't think there's no benefit there. The costs are just way too high.
That's a good point. There was a senior vice president at American Defense Prime looked me in the eye 8 years ago, and he said, the trouble with you guys selling software is that you might not be around. He said, well, how do I know you're going to be around? And I said, you keep paying me and I'll be around. and actually, that's the economic point, that if you can reliably pay and use a supplier, then that's ultimately good business for the enterprise.
But the small software developer companies or the software groups, also in biggest company, use internally open source tools. But that's because they are very technical people, so they are able to deal with customization and to go into the code and change the code or maintain their code. If you look at a different perspective, the business users, the QA team of the big company, the big banks, they are not so technical, so they are not able to go and code. And that's the reason why the former test automation tool, even the commercial one that has not been used and has not been so deeply used for automating, because even that kind of test automation tool required a lot of customization. When I introduced the test automation in the banking fields, we called a consulting company that made the customization of the scripts of the tool, because we were not able to program. We were testers. We were functional testers. So that's one of the main issues. It depends. I'm not saying that open source tools are not good. I'm saying that they are used in different fields.
Yeah, understood. So we've talked a little bit about the history and how we came to be there. What's your opinion on the future, on the development of test automation tools? There's been an interesting topic, I think, again in this room about machine learning. So when would I get a test tool that I press a button, it produces the test and maintains itself? I want to have this thing.
Let's talk after the conference.
To a certain extent, that exists already, actually. So there is technology. We have technology, particularly aimed at websites and things like that. We'll just go and do a whole bunch of testing over a web application because it's there and you can get to it and you can navigate around it well, and even you can fill in the gaps where you need to populate it with data and things like that. And it'll go and use kind of rules and things like that to define stuff. So you're not specifying any scenarios, but you're actually just doing a whole bunch of kind of hands-free automation over that type of application. And I think you're right. I think that will grow, and it'll go from compartmentalizing areas of the application and what we expect that to do, and then feeding that as we go through a process. So we know, okay, when we get here, this is how we test this bit. Now, how does that link to something else? And we'll be able to explore applications much more automated than we can now.
Yeah, I would say, the future really is here, and it's especially important that it's here because the trading industry has matured. So if you look at the trading industry right now, it's a lot of mature existing trading systems that connect to many other different trading systems. So we have a lot of connections. If we look 15 years ago, everything was still changing very fast. Not a lot of stuff was electronic. A lot of stuff was new greenfield trading system development. And now that we have a mature trading system environment, we have a lot more indication as to what the behavior of these trading systems are through message logs and behavior that's exhibited in production. And by analyzing that, we can generate tests, and we can automate the generation of tests. And so from our perspective, that's the type of testing that's important today, because people are doing less greenfield, I'm building a matching engine from scratch, and they're doing more migrations, integrations, and upgrades, which are just making incremental changes to existing behavior. You don't want to break everything that's already working today. You just want to make it a little bit better. And so regression testing and making sure that behavior works going forward is very important. And having that ability to generate the tests or generate models for model-based testing is very, very, very critical at this point.
Well, but that's an easy example when there is something already available for a test tool, and then you just build incremental steps on it. But if there's a company that's just taking an automation project and has nothing at all to build it up, it just has a set of requirements, probably a beta release of their software. That should be a short one. So a company which just has a set of requirements, probably a beta release, a company which is thinking about potential maintenance costs going forward. How do we automate, reduce human impact, human efforts on things like developing something from scratch in terms of the test cases and maintaining it once the requirements change? Is there a future behind that?
Well, I think it's hard to basically reduce the human effort for developing tests for new behavior, because you have no way to see the new behavior when you're developing this. So there's always going to be this need to develop test scripts or develop models for model-based testing from scratch. But at the same time, when you have an existing trading system with so much inertia, you have a lot more of the functionality covered from analyzing existing behavior through logs and stuff like that, that you don't have to worry about, okay, we got these new tests, we'll write those with a human effort, but we'll generate all these tests from existing log data, and having a continuous process that's continuously analyzing logs and getting changing behavior from production. You can feed that back into the cycle, into a continuous testing process, which is ultimately what all firms should strive to deploy.
All right.
I think one of the other things that will change about testing in general, but automation in particular, is the purpose of testing, I think, will expand, because at the moment it's there to find bugs, basically. But actually, it's also a source of knowledge in terms of how something should perform, or how it does actually perform, or how we want it to perform. So when we're implementing our solutions, very often we say to people, okay, don't write a test case for what you've got if you've got something already. Let's just test it as it is, and we'll find out what it does. And that fills a knowledge gap to say, okay, I didn't realise that part of the system did these things. I now understand how I can change it and what the impact of that change will be. So it becomes a definition of that part of the system. And later on downstream, at some point or other, we're going to have to tell someone how to use this stuff. So the first person to really know that is the person in testing or the assets created from testing. So we've now got knowledge described in testing. We've got the testing for the purpose of eliminating bugs. We've got testing for the purpose of informing people of actually how they should use the system going forwards. And I think that's one of the changes we'll see, is a much more joined up value of the assets and the output of testing throughout the system.
Right.
Yes.
If I can make it, sorry.
Sorry, I'll just want to remind you to keep it short, as we are probably
Yes,
running out of
just a
time.
couple of things. Just to add something to what George said, is that we have to test in order to find bugs, but also to prove that the system does what has been designed for. And that's another issue that has to be addressed in the testing in general, in the testing method, and applied with the testing tool. The risk-based testing, we have to test that the system performs what it has been designed for. And we have to we have to have the, sorry for my English, I'm the only not English in this panel, so. And no, we have to, we need the testing tool that support us in order to cover the functionality with the test automation.
I like the way you put it. Test tool is supporting us rather than we are supporting the test tool.
Yeah.
I think it's a good summary of the discussion. George, you.
Well, a little point again that today we received an order from the MOD, and a little while ago the British Ministry of Defence encouraged their procurement people to buy nearly good enough products. Now, why did they do that? Well, because they become a culture where they wanted the best boot, the best of everything, and consequently there was a huge gap between the very average boot they had and until the time they eventually found the best boot. So by buying nearly good enough, you actually get a solution that improves. Now, with respect, sometimes in the financial services world, we get that, so that we're asked for a roadmap and where are you with intelligence, and that becomes a reason to defer decisions. I would rather it not be that way, and that we buy nearly good enough now, and we start the process and the journey towards automation. I worked on the shop floor of the Ford engine plant, and at the time I was there was zero automation, and the automotive world moved on that journey and is now an extraordinarily highly automated world. And I think we need to move testing in the financial services, not in one big step, but in a series of steps.
All right, that's very interesting. Any quick questions from the audience, please? No, good. So,
Oh, we wanted long, awkward questions.
okay, there is one.
Hi. A comment was made earlier that it was an unhinged way to measure the success of a test automation program by the number of scripts written. What's the best way to measure the success of a test automation program?
I suggested that, but I'm sure George could be more eloquent in defining what would be a good way of doing it.
Well, I guess
Just again, trying to keep it short. Sorry.
my question to you would be, what are you trying to achieve? Of course, and metrics is a whole interesting area I could bang on about for ages. And I know one of the things that people love to count is the number of bugs, and I have a great philosophy that actually that's an irrelevant metric, and it takes one catastrophic bug, doesn't it, basically? So I think that really depends on what you're trying to achieve and what your objectives are.
I would say, traditional KPIs are things like number of bugs found in production versus numbers found by the, testing team or test automation. You can look at it as a percentage of the changes that were made to the system. You really have to adapt it for how your system is deployed. Some people deploy their software to customers, and in that case, you might say the number of customer discovered bugs. That might be the KPI that you're driving with.
All right, I think we are running out of time, so special thanks to our expert, Judge Wilson, Mariagrazia, Brunetti, Jacob Northey, and George Mackintosh. My name is Pavel Protsenko. Thanks very much for your attention, and have a great day.